Hey there! Welcome to a not-so-normal DIY where we're making a watercolor trinket dish out of air-dry clay. We're going to use a cushion, a bowl, and yep, a temporary tattoo. And I promise it's as weird as it sounds, and surprisingly very easy. I started with a small slab of air-dry clay and I have a plastic rolling pin and started rolling out my clay, and I got it pretty thin. Most of the stuff is usually about 1/4 of an inch thick, but this I kept a little bit thinner since why not? Everything else I'm doing here is going to be different than what I normally do. So I take and I roll out my clay, and I want to make sure that I have enough to fit over the bowl that I'm going to use as my shape. So I measured it out and noticed that it wasn't quite big enough. So I had to go back and roll out a little bit more and give myself a little bit more room. So now that I know that I have the right size, we're good to go. Then this is where it starts to get a little odd. I'm placing my rolled out air dry clay on top of a squishy crafting cushion. Something similar works great. Nothing fancy, just something soft with a little give. Next, I take a small bowl and I press it on the clay into the pillow. This helps the air dry clay wrap itself perfectly around the bowl. Bonus, it looks super pro with basically zero effort. So now that I have my clay pressed into my bowl, I flip the whole thing over and I trim all the excess clay around the edge. I have no rulers needed, no cookie cutters needed, just trim the excess off the air dry clay. You'll notice my edges are just a little rough, a little uneven, but that's okay. I'm not looking for perfect. I am just looking to experiment and see how it'll turn out. With every experiment, you learn something new. So in order to smooth down my edges, I'm going to get a little bit of water on my finger, and this is where I can kind of smooth out those rough edges. It's at this point that it's time to let it become completely dry. It usually takes a day or two. It all depends on your weather. Okay, so now that everything is dry, it looks really good. This is where we step into the next phase. We're going to do a light sanding. We're going to clean up our edges. We're going to find any imperfections within the body of our trinket tray that we might want to fix. Nothing, intense, just enough to make a nice soft finish for us to go ahead and end up painting. We don't want to forget about wiping off the dust, and it's probably a good idea to wear a mask when you're sanding. Okay, now we've got a nice, clean, smooth finish. The bowl looks great. Now we're going to go into the preparation for watercolor. This is Daniel Smith's watercolor ground. I have it in titanium white, which is what I'll use for this project, but it also comes in transparent. And what watercolor ground does for you is it makes any surface that you want into a watercolor canvas. You can paint on it with watercolor, and the watercolor reacts in its beautiful way right on any surface, whether it be clay or wood or metal. But what also is helpful with the air dry clay using the watercolor ground is it helps to protect the clay from adding any moisture back into your trinket tray. All right, now that we have everything dry, we're ready to paint. I just have a small Winsor & Newton watercolor palette here that I'm just spritzing and waking up. And I also have some metallic watercolors. I just love the way they shimmer in some of the projects that I've done. So I'm going to wake those up with a couple spritzes, and then we're going to get started on developing our trinket tray. I didn't really have any kind of plan. Right here I'm just adding some water and starting to introduce some blue. My thought process was I wanted the outside of the tray to have like this cloud-like effect. Not that I was going to actually paint the sky, but just see where it goes. And then the inside, I want it to be somewhat of a sun or sunflower, but with golden rays. So that was really the theory that I have as I attempt to paint on the colors that I like that I see in here. I have, again, like I said, I've just added some water to it, and I noticed that, you know, the air dry clay is holding up really well. The watercolor ground really seems to protect it from all the water that I'm adding to it. But the color that I have is, to me, a little too bright and a little too intense. So I'm going to go ahead and I'll cover the whole thing. But at one point, as we move forward, I will introduce a watercolor pencil. And we'll go ahead and introduce an indigo color to try and give it a little bit of depth. I dug into the Faber-Castell watercolor pencils, found my indigo blue, and wanted to try this technique for a long time. Grabbed a piece of sandpaper and started to sand the particles of the watercolor pencil onto my dish. And I'm going around in different areas, and you take a spritzer and start to dissolve those particles. Didn't quite turn out as I had hoped. A lot of pooling was happening, and that's okay. That's okay. It's a great experiment. I know that I will try it again. So I added a little more of the brighter blue from the Winsor Newton palette, and decided that I wanted to try the indigo one more time. So I went in and made watercolor out of it. I just put it on my palette and then just started to drop it in to the water that was already in existence on the dish. And I wasn't too bad. Okay, we're drying the outside of the Trinket dish and decided that we're going to go one more time to try and add a little more depth within this coloring. So once again, I got my Faber-Castell and was going to turn that into watercolor and see if we couldn't make this look a little bit more nighttime sky-like. And didn't have as much water this time, and just proceeded to add in the watercolor pencil watercolor. And it turned out good. I liked it a lot. So anyways, this was a good experiment, and I will try it again. All right, now we're starting on the inside. I opened up the Winsor Newton watercolor palette, and I'm just starting to apply water and add in some colors. So what we're going to do here is just experiment. I'm dropping in colors, and then I will add in metallic watercolor, and we can see where we end up. Alrighty, here we are. Everything's dry, painted, and ready to go. Now for one of our final experiments, and that's going to be adding a temporary tattoo to our Trinket dish. I wanted something that would fit nicely in the center. I trimmed it down to a circle, and if you've never used a temporary tattoo, there is a backing on either side. You take one side off, put it on your skin, and then you take a paper towel or wet cloth And the idea is you saturate the back of it and it releases the paper, and then your tattoo is on your skin. This time it's going to be on the Trinket dish. It was a little harder than I thought, and I needed a lot more water than I thought I would need. So I ended up, if you notice, picking up a lot of my watercolor that I had painstakingly painted. So back to the drawing board, painting a little bit more. All right, last step here. I chose triple thick gloss glaze. You could use Mod Podge or something like that. But if you notice here, I have a sponge brush. Not recommended. The little ends of it kind of disintegrated in there, and I had to constantly pick them out. Really annoying. But this is definitely a step you don't want to miss. You want to protect everything. You want the paint to be protected. It locks in the temporary tattoo, and it also gives the dish a finished, almost ceramic look, especially when you use the gloss. You definitely don't want to skip it. On the back side, I chose a brush. I got just a regular brush, and oh my goodness, what a difference. It went on so easy, and I just let everything dry completely. So that's it. This is a wrap. Your dish is done. Mine is not perfect, but it's perfectly mine. I love it. I can't wait to try this again. If you try this, please tag me. I'd love to see your air dry projects. Thanks so much for watching.